Yuskaya Autonomous Oblast because he was under the delusion that he could sell off these hostages to the American capitalists, believing that they would pay a ransom in order to get the Jews exmigrated to the United States. And he was all prepared in his disappointment, since the United States never responded to his overtures in this regard, to launch a second Holocaust had he not died and ended the Korean War. So in terms of the war itself, what we are dealing with is a number of different paradigms, and the American people have been exposed to basically one type of paradigm that totally eliminates their ability to understand what was going on with other participants in the conflict and how small a role that they played in that conflict in a certain sense on the continental mainland of Asia, and how vulnerable they became as the war drew to a close. This is the reason for the secrecy behind Roswell. So when J. Craw Gate speaks of rogue elements, it's important to emphasize that not only does he spell rogue incorrectly, but also these were not rogue elements, but part of an integrated strategy that was employed by Emperor Hirohito to ultimately get the results of a ceasefire and a peace which was advantageous to the Japanese people and to their eventual prosperity. When Americans think of the Pacific War, they tend to think of naval air battles, which are carrier-oriented, which they may think of marine amphibious invasions, which are extremely small in comparison to the enormous actions which took place on the continent, but extremely fierce, extremely concentrated, and incredibly different from what they were eventually going to face. Now, the reason that this is important is because it's one of the reasons why the Commander-in-Chief, the executive office as held by the President, should always be a former military veteran. That is always ideal. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was none, and therefore had an insane doctrine of unconditional surrender, which was going to throw America into a cataclysm. Whereas Harry Truman, who inherited his position, had been an artillery officer in World War I and was very aware of the dangers that he was facing, and ultimately was able to draw the conflict to a peace by being willing to negotiate with the emperor himself via the various conduits that had been set up via the Vatican, via Sweden, via Switzerland, and other neutral parties. When Americans think of the Pacific War, they are handed a map like this. This is the only type of map that Americans will ever see in regards to the Greater Pacific Conflict, which is how the Americans think of it. And in terms of the Greater Pacific Conflict, the Americans will be aware that by the end of the war, they controlled this much of the Pacific in terms of naval air supremacy and interdiction. They may be aware that at the time of the ceasefire, Japan had enormous tracts of land that were contiguous enough to give Japan a supply line to the oil of the Dutch East Indies, and they may be aware of various elements of that particular campaign. This is not how the British see the Second World War. If you were to ask the British about the Second World War, they would think of the Indian subcontinent, which tellingly is not even on an American printed map. For the British, the war in Asia was the battles of Setang in Burma, which is just peripherally here. Were the battles of Kohima. They were the battles of Impal, and these were massive tank battles that took place on the Indian continent with Japan and with Japan's allies, such as Sirhan Chandra Bose, who was an Asian Indian who had sided with the Japanese in order to liberate India from the British Raj. The reason that this is so important is because so many Americans never hear of Sirhan Chandra Bose and have no understanding of the Indian desire to fight for their freedom from the British imperialists. What the Americans will always hear of is Gandhi. And to the Asian Indians, this is very similar to the kind of conundrum we face between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X in the African American community. The American white majority loved Malcolm X so much that they made a holiday for him. But the African American community, especially young African American males, remember Malcolm X because Malcolm X was a symbol of empowerment. That was Sirhan Chandra Bose and what he represented to millions of Indians. And in terms of Martin Luther King Jr., if you ask a young African American male, what do you think of Martin Luther King Jr., they'll say, well, I know he was a black man who Whitey kept beating up and he never fought back. Well, that's why the British and the white world loves Gandhi. But in India, the hero is Sirhan Chandra Bose, a man who nobody in the West ever hears of, but who fought with the Japanese massive tank battles, engagements on the Indian subcontinent trying to take the capital of New Delhi. And these tanks that the British were using were mostly American Lend-Lease. They were Sherman tanks. And ultimately, Sirhan Chandra Bose survived the end of the war, and he died en route to Taiwan, the nation where I was born, escaping the British desire to, of course, capture him and execute him as what they would term a rebel or a terrorist. But in terms of the Indian people today, far more of the younger Indian generation will remember him as a symbol of nationalism than they would Gandhi. And the important thing is that he was inspired by a Western author, Jules Verne, who wrote the novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and its sequel, Mysterious Island. And the hero of that novel was an Asian Indian named Captain Nemo, who actually was Prince Dakkar of one of the princely states of India. Now, all of his novels, when they were translated into English, were literally censored. 25% of those novels were cut away so that everything that was published in the United States years later had no indication of the ethnicity or the national origins of the hero of that fictitious novel, Captain Nemo, and no one understood the motivation behind the submarine captain, which in Verne's novel, he was an Indian prince whose entire family had been murdered in front of his eyes by the British. This was the inspiration for nationalism for men like Sirhan Chandra Bose. But we have to ask ourselves, if the Anglo-American authorities are willing to do this with fiction, think of what they do with fact. Now, in terms of the Chinese view of the war, what we have is a strategic situation which was, of course, dominated by Japan. What we have is the Communist Chinese, we have the Nationalist Chinese, we have the Imperial Republic of Yuan Shikai and its heirs that were in the core area of China. This doesn't look like much, but it's important to emphasize to the American people that China, which up until the 1980s was 25% of the world's population, 1 out of every 4 people on Earth was Chinese, all of that population lived in 25% of China. All of Mongolia, all of the western Turkestani region, all of Tibet are arid deserts, they're mountains, they're inhabitable, they cannot grow food, and they are left for very, very small minorities, fly specks of population that eke out an existence in those various areas. The only other industrial area of any significance was Manchuria. So that Americans don't get confused. When they think of the movie The Last Emperor of China about Puyi, Puyi was Manchurian. He was an ethnic Manchu who had inherited a foreign dynasty that had lorded over the Chinese people for hundreds of years. Yuan Shikai was the first Han Chinese or ethnic Chinese emperor in 300 years to declare himself such. Now, both of these men sided with the Japanese to declare war on the United States, as did Emperor Bao Dai of Vietnam to ensure his nation's independence from the French, as did the Emperor of Thailand. And there's a reason why emperors get along, is of course the modern democracies or communisms of the world around them are basically anathema to the ability of their societies to function. And in this regard, what had happened was the Japanese, this was in 1945, had maintained all of the control over the areas of China that were worth controlling. So you had the ultimate nightmare for the American people developing on the mainland, where even after the Soviet invasion into Manchuria, you had an exile of, as I said, 90% of the Japanese army living in China, who would become the officers' corps for millions of Chinese soldiers. And at that point, America could not win the war. This is the threat which the Americans were facing when they were going to invade